The United States is willing to pay $700 billion for an ice-covered island that produces almost nothing. That number isn't speculation. It is the actual price estimate generated by former officials and scholars working on the acquisition proposal right now, $700 billion for Greenland. To put that in perspective, that's more than America paid for every territorial acquisition in its history combined, adjusted for inflation. The Louisiana Purchase, Alaska, the territories that became half the continental United States, all of it, less than what's being discussed for Greenland today. Why? What's actually on that island that justifies that kind of money? The official answer is national security and rare earth minerals. That's what you'll hear in every news report, every policy paper, every statement from officials. But here's what nobody's explaining. The United States already has a military base in Greenland. We've had one since World War II. The Patuxent Space Base sits in northwestern Greenland with missile detection systems pointed at Russia. We already control the strategic position. We already have the security foothold. So why the sudden obsession with owning the entire island? And why now, in 2025, after decades of this not being a priority? Because something changed. Something that makes Greenland worth more than national security talking points and mineral reserve estimates. Something that transforms this frozen island from a strategic asset into an existential necessity. And once you see what that something is, the $700 billion price tag starts to make sense in a way that rare earth elements never could. Welcome to Finance Historian. Here we break down global finance. Just a quick reminder, before we get started, smash the like button and subscribe if you love financial deep dives. Comment your city and the time you're watching this. I want to see how global this community is. Let me show you what's really happening. Greenland is 836,000 square miles. That's roughly 3 times the size of Texas. 80% of it sits under an ice sheet that is up to 2 miles thick in some places. The population is 56,000 people, most living in scattered coastal towns accessible only by boat or helicopter because roads don't exist between settlements. The entire economy runs on fishing and an annual subsidy from Denmark of about 520 million euros. Greenland's GDP is around $3.5 billion. For context, that's less than the annual revenue of a mid-sized American shopping mall chain. This is not a functioning economy. This is not a resource powerhouse. This is a frozen territory that Denmark supports financially because it's been part of their kingdom since the 1700s. And yet, the United States is treating the acquisition of this island as a top foreign policy priority. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been personally tasked with developing a purchase proposal. White House officials are calling it high priority. The discussion has moved from theoretical interest to active planning. What changed? Start with what didn't change. The rare earth minerals everyone keeps mentioning have been there for decades. Greenland ranks 8th in the world for rare earth reserves with 1.5 million tons. The Kvanefjeld and Tanbris sites in southern Greenland contain some of the largest deposits on Earth. Elements like neodymium and dysprosium, critical for electric vehicle batteries, wind turbines, military equipment, all sitting under Greenlandic soil. This has been known since the 1980s. Geological surveys mapped these deposits 40 years ago. But here's the reality of Greenland's mining industry as of March 2025. The island has exactly 2 active mines. One produces gold and is just being commissioned. The other extracts anorthosite, a type of rock used in various applications. That's it. A ruby mine went bankrupt and closed in 2024. No rare earth mining has ever taken place on Greenland. 0 production. Not a single ton extracted commercially. Why? Because mining in Greenland is extraordinarily difficult. Only 20% of the island is ice-free. Temperatures drop below negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The mining season is limited to a few months per year in most locations. There are no roads connecting mining sites to ports, no railroads. Transportation depends entirely on ships and aircraft, which means costs are astronomical compared to mining operations anywhere else on Earth. Companies have tried. Multiple mining ventures have gone bankrupt attempting to extract Greenland's resources. The economics don't work at current commodity prices and with current technology. So if rare earths aren't being mined and won't be economically viable for years, possibly decades, why the urgency? Why $700 billion for theoretical mineral wealth that might never be extracted? The answer isn't in the ground, it's on the surface. Actually, it's in what's disappearing from the surface. Greenland's ice sheet is melting at a rate of 270 billion tons per year. That's 30 million tons every single hour. Since 1995, an area the size of Albania has melted. This isn't a future projection. This is current measured loss, and it's accelerating. What was frozen and inaccessible for thousands of years is becoming exposed, not in some distant future scenario. Right now, this changes everything about Greenland's strategic value, but not in the way most analysis suggests. Yes, melting ice exposes mineral deposits. Yes, it opens new shipping routes. But there's something else happening that's far more significant. Something that explains why the United States is moving with sudden urgency after decades of passive interest. Greenland sits at a geographic choke point that's about to become the most contested waterway on Earth. The island straddles two emerging Arctic shipping routes. The Northwest Passage runs along the northern coast of North America. The Transpolar Sea Route cuts through the center of the Arctic Ocean. Both routes pass directly by Greenland. As ice melts and these passages become navigable year-round, they'll reduce shipping time between Asia and Europe by thousands of miles compared to current routes through the Suez Canal or around Africa. Control those routes, and you control a significant percentage of global trade. Not today, but 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when Arctic shipping becomes standard rather than experimental. Whoever controls Greenland controls the gatekeeper position for both passages. But that's still not the full picture. Shipping routes are valuable, but they're not $700 billion valuable. There's a deeper layer. Greenland also sits astride the GIUK gap. That's the naval choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. This gap connects the Arctic Ocean to the Atlantic. Any Russian submarine leaving port and heading toward the Atlantic has to pass through the GIUK gap. During the Cold War, the United States and NATO maintained constant surveillance of this passage, specifically to track Soviet submarine movements. The gap was crucial to defending transatlantic shipping lanes and monitoring Russian naval capabilities. After the Cold War ended, the GIUK gap became less of a priority. Russia's navy declined. The threat seemed diminished. Surveillance decreased. But Russia never stopped developing Arctic capabilities. Since 2014, Moscow has systematically reopened old Soviet military bases in the Arctic and built new facilities. They've reconstructed airfields. They've deployed advanced missile systems. Russia currently has a far larger military presence in the Arctic than the United States. And that presence is growing. Russia controls more than half of the Arctic Ocean coastline. They consider themselves the Arctic power, and they're acting like it. New bases, new equipment, new strategic focus. Meanwhile, the United States reduced its Greenland presence from 10,000 personnel during the Cold War to about 150 today at Patuxent Space Base. We maintained the minimum necessary footprint while Russia was building maximum capability. Now add China to this equation. In 2018, China declared itself a near-Arctic state. Not a joke, an official policy designation. China has no Arctic territory. Beijing is thousands of miles from the Arctic Circle, but they declared themselves a near-Arctic state anyway, and launched something called the Polar Silk Road as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. The goal is clear: gain influence in the Arctic through infrastructure investment, resource extraction deals, and scientific research that doubles as intelligence gathering. Chinese companies have attempted to buy ports in Greenland. They've sought mining rights. They've proposed infrastructure projects. Most have been blocked due to security concerns, but the interest remains. The United States suspects correctly that China's real objective isn't just commercial. It's strategic positioning, dual-use sensors and radar installations disguised as civilian infrastructure, intelligence collection on U.S. space operations, control over future shipping choke points, Russia rebuilding Arctic military power, China pushing for Arctic access. And Greenland sitting at the center of it all, melting, opening, becoming accessible and valuable in ways it never was before. That's the context driving U.S. urgency. But there's still one more element that transforms this from important to critical. Something about what happens when that ice melts that goes beyond shipping routes and military positioning. Rare earth elements. That's what transforms Greenland from strategically important to absolutely critical. These aren't precious metals. They're not commodities you've heard of on the news. There are 17 chemical elements with names most people can't pronounce. Neodymium, dysprosium, praseodymium, yttrium. Elements buried in the periodic table that nobody thinks about until you realize they're in everything that defines modern civilization. Every electric vehicle motor contains rare earth magnets. Every wind turbine uses them. Every smartphone, every laptop, every guided missile, every fighter jet targeting system. The entire green energy transition depends on rare earth elements. So does modern warfare. You cannot build advanced military technology without them. Greenland ranks 8th globally for rare earth reserves, 1.5 million tons confirmed. Two massive deposits, Kvanefjeld and Tanbreeze, among the largest concentrations anywhere on Earth. The Kvanefjeld site alone contains enough neodymium and dysprosium to supply decades of manufacturing for electric vehicles, wind turbines, and defense systems. But here's where it gets interesting. China controls 70% of global rare earth production. Not extraction, production. The actual mining, processing, and refining that turns raw ore into usable materials. The European Union is 100% dependent on Chinese imports for heavy, rare earths. 100%. The United States isn't much better. We rely overwhelmingly on foreign supply chains, primarily Chinese, for these critical materials. This creates a strategic vulnerability that keeps Pentagon planners awake at night. Imagine a conflict scenario with China over Taiwan. What happens when Beijing cuts off rare earth exports? Our ability to manufacture precision weapons, advanced electronics, and next-generation military systems depends on materials controlled by the adversary we're fighting. That's not hypothetical risk, that's catastrophic dependency. Greenland offers the only viable Western alternative. The deposits are massive. The quality is high. The mix of light and heavy rare earths is exactly what advanced manufacturing requires. If the United States controlled Greenland's rare earth resources, we'd break Chinese monopoly power and secure supply chains for the technologies that will define the next 50 years. Except there's a problem. No rare earth mining happens in Greenland today. Not a single operation. The island has 2 active mines as of March 2025. One produces gold and it's still being commissioned. The other extracts anorthosite, a type of rock used in certain industrial processes. A ruby mine closed in 2024 after bankruptcy. That's it. The massive rare earth deposits everyone talks about, untouched. Why? Because mining in Greenland is brutally difficult. 80% of the island sits under ice. The parts that aren't frozen reach temperatures of negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit during winter. Mining operations are only feasible during brief summer windows. Outside Greenland's handful of small cities, infrastructure doesn't exist. No roads, no railroads. Transport depends entirely on ships and aircraft. Getting equipment to a mine site costs exponentially more than in traditional mining regions. Then there's processing. Rare earth ore isn't useful straight from the ground. It requires extensive chemical processing to separate the valuable elements from surrounding rock. This processing is environmentally intensive. It produces radioactive waste and toxic byproducts. Greenland has limited environmental capacity and strong local opposition to projects that threaten ecosystems. This is why, despite 5 decades of hype about Greenland's mineral wealth, actual production remains nearly zero. An attempt to mine iron ore ended in bankruptcy. Petroleum exploration, despite optimistic geological surveys suggesting 17.5 billion barrels of oil and 148 trillion cubic feet of natural gas offshore, has yielded nothing. A 2021 moratorium on new oil drilling froze further exploration. Bloomberg's Javier Blas wrote in 2025 that hyperbole around Greenland and commodities has a 50-year history. Lots of talk, minimal results. The resources exist, but extraction faces obstacles that have defeated every major attempt so far. But climate change is altering that equation. An area the size of Albania has melted since 1995. Greenland loses 270 billion tons of ice annually. That's 30 million tons per hour. Resources buried under kilometers of ice for millennia are becoming accessible. Melting ice exposes mineral deposits. It opens potential mining sites. It creates possibilities that didn't exist a generation ago, and someone is betting that trajectory continues. In June 2025, the U.S. Export-Import Bank sent a letter of interest to Critical Metals Corp for a $120 million loan to fund the Tanbreeze rare earth mine in Greenland. If approved, it would mark the Trump administration's first overseas investment in a mining project. The U.S. government doesn't issue letters of interest casually. This signals serious intent. Combine rare earth potential with everything else. The Geopolitics gap. The shipping routes. Russian military expansion. Chinese Arctic ambitions. You're looking at an island that sits at the intersection of every major strategic concern facing the United States over the next half-century. Control Greenland, and you control access to the Arctic. You control critical choke points. You break Chinese rare earth monopoly. You prevent Russian or Chinese positioning in the Western Hemisphere. That's why the $700 billion price tag does not sound insane to people running these calculations. It's not $700 billion for an empty island. It's $700 billion for permanent strategic advantage in the Arctic, guaranteed rare earth supply for the next century, and denial of those same advantages to competitors. Trump's interest isn't new. He's been talking about Greenland since at least 2017. During his first presidency, Ron Lauder suggested the United States purchase Greenland and offered to act as a back channel to the Danish government. Trump later claimed the idea was his personal inspiration. He tasked National Security Advisor John Bolton to study it. Bolton passed the assignment to Fiona Hill, who assembled a small team and engaged in secret talks with Denmark's ambassador. That first attempt went nowhere. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called the idea absurd. Trump canceled a planned visit to Denmark in response. The proposal died, treated by even Trump's closest aides as a distraction rather than serious policy. But something shifted in his second term. The designs on Greenland are being taken far more seriously now, both inside his administration and among America's allies. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been directed to craft a proposal to purchase the territory. A senior White House official described it as a high priority, not a talking point, a high priority assignment for the Secretary of State. Trump's public statements have escalated. He said the United States needs Greenland from a national security standpoint, and that Denmark is not going to be able to defend it. He's claimed Russian and Chinese ships cover Greenland's waters. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stated that all options remain on the table, including military options, though she emphasized diplomacy comes first. That last part matters. Military options. Those words entered official White House communication about Greenland, not hypothetical, not metaphorical. Actual policy language acknowledging that military action is among the options under consideration. This represents a fundamental shift from the first term, when the purchase idea was treated as Trump's personal quirk. Now it's formal policy being developed at the highest levels of government. The question isn't whether the administration wants Greenland. The question is how far they're willing to go to get it, and what happens when Denmark and Greenland say no, because they already have, repeatedly and unambiguously. That collision between American strategic ambition and Greenlandic sovereignty is where this story gets complicated in ways that go far beyond military bases and rare earth deposits. Greenland's Prime Minister Mut Egede delivered the most direct response in January 2025. We don't want to be Danish, we don't want to be American, we want to be Greenlandic. That single sentence captures the fundamental problem with every American proposal to acquire the territory. The people who actually live there have zero interest in becoming part of the United States. Poll numbers make this brutally clear. A January 2025 survey found 85% of Greenlanders oppose leaving Denmark to join the United States. Just 6% support the idea. Those aren't soft numbers that could shift with the right sales pitch. That's overwhelming rejection of the entire concept. But here's what makes the situation more complex than simple polling data suggests. That same population does want independence from Denmark. Greenland unveiled its first draft constitution in 2023, calling for creation of a Greenlandic republic. The March 2025 parliamentary election brought the center-right Democratic Party to power, which advocates for gradual independence. A report expected by the end of 2026 will outline possible paths to full sovereignty. Greenlanders want to be their own country. They just don't want to trade Danish control for American control. The independence movement isn't about joining a different empire. It's about self-determination for an indigenous population that's been under colonial administration for centuries. Denmark's position mirrors Greenland's rejection. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has repeatedly stated that Greenland is not for sale, and warned that American pressure could threaten NATO itself. In 2025, for the first time in history, Denmark's official threat assessment mentioned the United States as a national security concern, listing it alongside Russia and China. 7 European leaders issued a joint statement defending Greenland's sovereignty. Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the United Kingdom declared that Greenland belongs to its people, and decisions about its future are for Denmark and Greenland and them only. That's America's closest allies publicly rebuking the administration's Arctic ambitions. Protests have erupted across Greenland and Denmark. Demonstrators carry signs reading, "We are not for sale," "No means no," and "Yankee go home." The Trump administration's escalating rhetoric has accomplished something remarkable, uniting Greenlanders and Danes against American interests in a way that decades of cooperation never did. Even within the United States, support is minimal. A January 2026 poll showed only 8% of Americans support using military force to take Greenland, with 73% opposed. Congress has been equally dismissive. Senator Ruben Gallego introduced a resolution to block any invasion. Senator Roger Wicker, the top Republican on the Armed Services Committee, said after meeting with Danish and Greenlandic officials that there's no willingness on their part to negotiate for the purchase or change in title to their land. House Speaker Mike Johnson, one of Trump's closest allies, flatly stated, "I don't think anybody's seriously considering military action, and in Congress, we're certainly not. The legislative branch is signaling it won't authorize force and may actively work to prevent it. So we have unanimous rejection from Greenland, strong opposition from Denmark, public rebukes from major European allies, congressional resistance, and minimal American public support. The diplomatic path appears completely blocked, which raises the obvious question, what exactly is the administration planning to do about this? One possibility is that the entire campaign is theater, strategic posturing designed to extract concessions on other issues. Maybe the real goal isn't acquiring Greenland, but pressuring Denmark and Europe on defense spending, trade terms, or NATO contributions. Threaten something extreme to make your actual demand seem reasonable by comparison. But multiple indicators suggest this goes beyond negotiating tactics. The Export-Import Bank sent a letter of interest for a $120 million loan to fund the Tanbreeze rare earth mine in Greenland. That's the Trump administration's first potential overseas investment in a mining project. You don't commit that kind of financial infrastructure to a bluff. Rubio receiving direct orders to craft a purchase proposal, described as high priority by senior officials, indicates serious policy development. The language around military options being on the table has appeared in official White House communications, not just Trump's off-the-cuff remarks. The administration appears to be pursuing a multi-track strategy. Track 1 is continued diplomatic pressure, making the proposal repeatedly, keeping it in headlines, normalizing the idea that Greenland's status is negotiable. Track 2 involves economic engagement, funding mining projects, increasing American investment, creating financial dependencies that could influence future decisions. Track 3 is military positioning. The United States already maintains Patuxent Space Base with roughly 150 personnel. That presence could expand significantly without requiring permission if framed as necessary defense upgrades. More personnel, more infrastructure, more operational capability, gradually increasing American footprint until the distinction between Danish sovereignty and American control becomes purely technical. Track 4, the one nobody wants to discuss openly, involves waiting for the right crisis. A Russian provocation in the Arctic, a Chinese attempt to establish facilities in Greenland, a collapse in Greenlandic-Danish relations. Some triggering event that creates justification for American intervention presented as protecting Greenland rather than seizing it. The historical precedent here isn't reassuring. The United States has a long record of acquiring territory through methods other than straightforward purchase. Hawaii wasn't exactly a voluntary annexation. Neither was Puerto Rico. The Philippines, Guam, American Samoa all became U.S. territories through combinations of military action, strategic positioning, and opportunistic timing that had little to do with what local populations wanted. Greenland's legal status as an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark creates interesting complications. Under the 2009 Self-Government Act, Greenland can declare independence after a referendum and Danish parliamentary approval. But what happens if Greenland declares independence and immediately faces pressure from Russia or China? Would a newly independent Greenland with 56,000 people and virtually no military capability be able to resist great power competition for control of the Arctic? That scenario creates an opening. If Greenland pursues independence, the United States could position itself as the necessary security guarantor. Not through annexation, but through a relationship similar to existing compacts of free association with Palau, the Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. Those nations are independent, but grant the United States exclusive military access and receive substantial financial support in return. A Greenlandic republic in free association with the United States would give Washington everything it actually needs. Military basing rights, exclusive access to rare earth deposits, control over who else gets access to Greenlandic territory and resources. Greenland maintains nominal independence and self-governance, while America gets strategic control. Denmark is cut out entirely, no longer relevant to the equation. This approach has advantages over outright purchase or annexation. It's easier to sell internationally. It gives Greenlanders the independence they want, at least on paper. It avoids the messy questions about citizenship, representation, and governance that would come with making Greenland a U.S. territory. And it accomplishes American strategic objectives without the $700 billion price tag. The problem is, China and Russia can offer the same deal. An independent Greenland desperate for financial support and security guarantees could easily find itself courted by Beijing or Moscow. Chinese investment in mining infrastructure, Russian security cooperation. Either would give those powers exactly what the United States is trying to prevent: strategic positioning in the Arctic and access to critical minerals. This puts Greenland in an impossible position. Stay with Denmark and face continued American pressure. Pursue independence and become a prize in great power competition. Accept American protection and lose the self-determination they're fighting for. Align with China or Russia and guarantee American intervention, possibly military. There's no good option because Greenland's geography and resources make true independence functionally impossible. The island sits at too strategic a location with too many valuable resources for major powers to simply leave it alone. Whatever Greenlanders want for their future, the decisions will ultimately be made in Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and Copenhagen, not in Nuuk. The next 18 months will clarify which direction this moves. Denmark's threat assessment listing the United States as a security concern represents a fundamental break in the relationship. You don't include your closest ally in the same category as Russia and China unless you genuinely believe they pose a threat. That assessment was published by intelligence services, not politicians. It reflects professional analysis of American intentions. NATO faces its most serious internal crisis since formation. An alliance built on collective defense now includes one member threatening another member's territory. If the United States takes any action against Greenland, does Article 5 apply? Would European NATO members be obligated to defend Denmark against the United States? The entire framework of transatlantic security could collapse over this single issue. Trump's actual strategy doesn't require NATO to survive this crisis. Breaking the alliance might be the point. A fractured NATO serves multiple American interests that have nothing to do with Greenland specifically. European defense spending has remained below agreed targets for decades. Germany, France, and others have relied on American military guarantees while building economic ties with China and Russia that directly undermine American strategic interests. The Greenland crisis creates leverage. European nations now understand that American security commitments aren't permanent or unconditional. They're watching their most powerful ally threaten military action against a European territory. That fundamentally changes calculations about defense independence and strategic autonomy. If NATO collapses or becomes irrelevant, Europe faces a choice. Build independent military capability sufficient to deter Russia without American support, or accept a multipolar Arctic where American, Russian, and Chinese spheres of influence coexist without the constraining framework of collective defense. Either outcome benefits Washington's position. European military buildup reduces the burden on American defense budgets. Multipolar acceptance allows the United States to pursue Arctic interests without alliance constraints. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's task to develop a purchase proposal represents the diplomatic track, but diplomacy here serves as cover for other approaches that are already underway. The United States Export-Import Bank sent a letter of interest in June 2025 to Critical Metals Corporation for a $120 million loan to fund the Tanbreez rare earth mine in Greenland. If approved, this becomes the Trump administration's first overseas mining investment. That's not coincidental timing. American capital flowing into Greenlandic mining creates facts on the ground before any political resolution. Once American companies control access to rare earth deposits, once American financing makes projects viable, once American technical expertise becomes essential to extraction operations, the question of sovereignty becomes secondary to operational reality. Greenland might remain Danish on paper while becoming economically American in practice. This mirrors Chinese tactics in Africa and Southeast Asia. Beijing doesn't need to own territory when Chinese companies control the ports, the mines, the infrastructure. Economic dependence creates strategic control without the complications of formal sovereignty. The United States is applying the same playbook in Greenland. Fund the mining projects Denmark won't finance. Provide the security guarantees Denmark can't provide. Create dependency relationships that make American presence essential, regardless of political status. Greenland's mining reality complicates every optimistic projection about rare earth wealth. The island currently operates exactly 2 mines. One produces gold and is still being commissioned. The other, owned by Lumina Sustainable Materials, extracts anorthosite. A ruby mine went bankrupt in 2024. No rare earth mining has ever occurred on Greenland despite 50 years of hyperbole about mineral wealth. The climate makes mining extraordinarily difficult. Only 20% of Greenland is ice-free. Temperatures drop below -40 Fahrenheit. The mining season is short. Transportation infrastructure doesn't exist outside the few small cities. No roads, no railroads. Everything moves by ship or aircraft, massively increasing costs. Previous attempts to mine iron ore ended in bankruptcy because the economics didn't work. The resources are real, but accessing them profitably is another matter entirely. This creates an opening for American involvement that appears economically rational rather than geopolitically aggressive. Greenland wants to develop its resources. Denmark won't fund the infrastructure required. Private companies won't invest without security guarantees and political stability. The United States offers both. American financing makes projects viable. American security presence protects investments. American technical expertise solves extraction problems in extreme conditions. Greenlanders might accept this arrangement even while rejecting political annexation. Economic development without losing sovereignty. Jobs and revenue without becoming American. It's a compromise that preserves independence while delivering the benefits that independence currently can't provide. But economic integration creates strategic dependency that's harder to reverse than political agreements. Once American companies control the supply chain for Greenlandic rare earths, once American financing underwrites the entire mining sector, once American security guarantees protect the infrastructure, Greenland's theoretical independence becomes meaningless. You can't pursue policies that threaten your only customer, your only financier, your only security guarantor. The relationship becomes asymmetric in ways that constrain Greenlandic decision-making as effectively as direct political control. China understands this perfectly because they've executed the same strategy globally. The Belt and Road Initiative creates dependency relationships that give Beijing influence without formal control. Sri Lanka couldn't repay Chinese loans and handed over Hambantota Port on a 99-year lease. Pakistan's Gwadar Port operates under Chinese management. African nations rich in resources find themselves unable to resist Chinese terms because Chinese financing made development possible when no one else would invest. The United States is now deploying Chinese tactics against Chinese interests. Beat Beijing to Greenlandic rare earths, using the same economic dependency model China uses everywhere else. The difference is, American presence in Greenland has legitimate security justifications that Chinese presence in Africa doesn't. Protecting North American airspace, monitoring Russian submarine activity through the Guyuk Gap, maintaining Arctic shipping route access. These aren't manufactured threats. They're real strategic requirements that happen to align with economic interests in rare earth access. Russia's Arctic military presence makes American security arguments impossible to dismiss. Moscow has opened multiple military bases above the Arctic Circle since 2014, restored Soviet-era infrastructure, reconstructed airfields. The Northern Fleet operates from Arctic bases. Russia controls over half the Arctic Ocean coastline and considers itself the Arctic power. Russian military capabilities in the region far exceed American presence, which has declined dramatically since Cold War peaks of 10,000 personnel in Greenland, down to roughly 150 at Patuxent Space Base today. This imbalance gives credibility to arguments that Denmark cannot adequately defend Greenland against Russian pressure. Denmark's entire military consists of roughly 16,000 active personnel. The Danish Navy operates a handful of frigates and patrol vessels. The Air Force has fewer than 60 combat aircraft. This is not a force capable of contesting Russian Arctic dominance. Danish defense spending has historically run below NATO's 2% of GDP target. Copenhagen has neither the capability nor the will to militarily defend Greenland against a serious threat. Greenlanders recognize this vulnerability. Surveys show 85% oppose joining the United States, but that doesn't mean they're confident in Danish protection. The same population that rejects American annexation also pursues independence from Denmark. They want sovereignty, but sovereignty requires the ability to defend yourself. A Greenlandic republic with 56,000 citizens has no realistic path to independent defense capability. The annual block grant from Denmark of approximately 520 million euros barely sustains the current economy. Building a military from scratch while funding basic governance and economic development is financially impossible. This creates the dependency trap. Independence requires security. Security requires either alliance or capability. Capability requires resources Greenland doesn't have. Alliance means choosing between Denmark, America, or potentially China and Russia. Every option involves subordinating Greenlandic interests to a more powerful partner. True independence isn't actually available as a realistic option, regardless of what Greenlanders prefer. The timeline for resolution is compressing. Greenland's government expects to publish a report by the end of 2026 outlining paths to independence. That report will force concrete decisions about security arrangements and economic partnerships that have remained theoretical. Once specific proposals exist, major powers will respond with competing offers. The diplomatic situation that seems stable because nothing has actually changed, yet will become unstable when real choices must be made. American pressure is already reshaping Greenlandic politics. The March 2025 parliamentary election delivered victory to the center-right Democratic Party, which advocates gradual independence rather than immediate separation from Denmark. That sounds moderate, but gradual independence still means independence. The party that won campaigned on sovereignty while acknowledging economic reality. They're looking for the arrangement that maximizes autonomy while maintaining financial viability. American economic partnership might fit that formula better than continued Danish dependency, especially if Washington offers better terms than Copenhagen. Trump's administration is moving beyond rhetorical interest. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been directed to develop a formal purchase proposal within weeks. This represents a significant escalation from the 2019 approach, when the idea was floated publicly but never developed into serious policy. The White House has described Greenland acquisition as a high priority, not a negotiating position or distraction. Cost estimates have been generated, $700 billion according to scholars and former officials working on planning. That figure isn't arbitrary speculation. It represents calculation of what compensating Denmark and establishing infrastructure would require. Whether that number is accurate or not, the fact that specific figures are being discussed indicates serious internal planning. The Export-Import Bank's $120 million letter of interest to Critical Metals Corporation for the Tanbreeze Rare Earth Mine signals economic engagement preceding political resolution. This would be the Trump administration's first overseas mining investment. The timing isn't coincidental. Establishing American financial stakes in Greenlandic resource development creates facts on the ground before sovereignty questions are resolved. Chinese companies attempted similar approaches before security concerns blocked those projects. Washington is using the same playbook, but with the advantage of existing military presence and alliance relationships that Beijing lacks. European response has unified against American pressure in ways that strain NATO cohesion. Leaders from Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the United Kingdom issued a joint statement affirming that Greenland belongs to its people, and sovereignty decisions rest with Denmark and Greenland alone. That statement came from major NATO allies publicly opposing American policy. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen warned that Trump's approach could lead to the demise of the NATO alliance. Denmark's Defense Intelligence Service included the United States as a national security threat in its official assessment for the first time in history, listed alongside Russia and China. This represents collapse of trust within the alliance that has structured European security for 75 years. Congressional opposition from both parties complicates execution, but doesn't prevent it. Senator Ruben Gallego introduced a resolution to block military action against Greenland. Senator Roger Wicker stated clearly that Danish and Greenlandic officials have no willingness to negotiate purchase or title change. House Speaker Mike Johnson dismissed suggestions of military force, but congressional opposition to presidential action in foreign affairs has limited practical effect, unless Congress controls funding or declares war. The president commands military deployment and conducts diplomacy. Congressional disapproval creates political cost, but not legal barrier, unless specific legislation passes both chambers and survives veto. What mechanisms could actually transfer control? Outright purchase requires willing sellers. Denmark and Greenland have both refused. Military seizure would fracture NATO and isolate America internationally. Those options are non-starters regardless of Trump's rhetoric. But there are intermediate arrangements that could achieve American objectives without formal sovereignty transfer. Enhanced defense agreements that expand Patuxent Space Base and establish additional installations. Economic partnerships that make Greenland financially dependent on American investment rather than Danish subsidies. Infrastructure development, funded by Washington, that creates physical American presence throughout the island. Resource extraction agreements that give American companies exclusive mining rights in exchange for revenue sharing. These arrangements could be structured as partnerships respecting Greenlandic sovereignty while functionally achieving American control. Greenland gets economic development it cannot fund independently. America gets military access and resource rights. Denmark gets relieved of financial burden. Everyone can claim victory while the practical reality shifts. This is how empires have historically expanded without conquest. Economic integration preceding political absorption. The British East India Company controlled India for decades before formal annexation. American corporations dominated Central American economies before military interventions formalized political control. The pattern is well established. Greenlandic politics are moving toward receptiveness despite current public opposition. The Democratic Party victory in March 2025 brought to power politicians who want independence but recognize economic constraints. They're looking for arrangements that maximize autonomy while maintaining financial viability. American partnership could provide that if terms are structured correctly. Opposition to joining the United States doesn't mean opposition to American investment or security guarantees. Greenlanders want to be Greenlandic, not American or Danish. But being Greenlandic requires funding governance and defense. If Washington offers better terms than Copenhagen while respecting local governance, the political calculation shifts. China's failed attempts to invest in Greenlandic infrastructure demonstrate that other powers see the same opportunity. Beijing tried to buy ports and mining rights. Those projects were blocked by security concerns, but the fact that China attempted them shows Greenland's strategic value is recognized globally. Russia's Arctic military expansion similarly indicates Moscow's awareness of the region's importance. Both powers would prefer Greenland remain weakly defended under nominal Danish control, rather than becoming an American territory with enhanced military presence. Their opposition to American acquisition is strategic, not principled. They benefit from the current arrangement where Denmark lacks capability to exclude them from Arctic operations. Climate change accelerates the timeline by making resources accessible and shipping routes viable. Greenland loses 270 billion tons of ice annually, 30 million tons per hour. An area the size of Albania has melted since 1995. This trend continues regardless of emission reduction efforts already implemented. Within 2 decades, significant portions of southern Greenland will be ice-free year-round. Mining operations that are currently impossible due to climate will become feasible. The Northwest Passage and Transpolar Sea Route will handle commercial shipping traffic that currently uses the Suez Canal or Panama Canal, reducing Asia-Europe transit time by weeks. Whoever controls Greenland controls access to those routes and the resources beneath the melting ice. That reality drives urgency on all sides. The economic prize extends beyond rare earths. Oil and gas reserves potentially include 17.5 billion barrels of oil and 148 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, according to U.S. Geological Survey estimates. Those figures are speculative based on limited exploration, but even if actual reserves are half the estimate, that represents massive energy resources. Greenland currently has a moratorium on new oil drilling implemented in 2021, but that policy could change under different governance. A Greenlandic government desperate for revenue or an American administration controlling the territory could lift restrictions and develop offshore fields. The geological value of all known mineral resources combined could exceed $4 trillion. That's not annual production. That's total resource value if everything were extracted and sold. But even capturing 10% of that value would transform Greenland's economy and generate enormous returns for whoever controls extraction rights. Trump's real estate background shapes his approach in ways that make negotiation difficult. He views Greenland as a property transaction. Size of the island impresses him. 836,000 square miles is massive compared to anything in his development portfolio. He told advisors it would be a great real estate deal securing his place in history. Owning versus leasing matters to him. Current arrangements give America basing rights similar to leasing. Trump wants ownership because ownership provides permanence and control that leases don't guarantee. Denmark could theoretically revoke base agreements. Ownership prevents that. This perspective clashes with Greenlandic and Danish views that treat sovereignty as non-negotiable principle rather than property right, subject to transaction. But the transactional mindset might actually enable resolution that principled positions cannot achieve. If all parties treat this as negotiation over interests rather than ideology, deals become possible. Greenland wants development funding and autonomy. Denmark wants to reduce financial burden and avoid conflict. America wants strategic access and resource rights. Those interests aren't mutually exclusive. A three-party agreement could satisfy everyone's core requirements, while leaving symbolic questions of sovereignty ambiguous. Greenland remains nominally under Danish realm, but governed independently with American security guarantees and investment. Denmark maintains formal sovereignty while transferring financial responsibility. America gains functional control without formal annexation. The arrangement could be marketed domestically as victory for all sides. Historical precedent for ambiguous sovereignty arrangements exists. Hong Kong operated under British control, while nominally Chinese territory for 99 years. Puerto Rico remains unincorporated territory of the United States, neither state nor independent nation. Greenland itself already has autonomous status within the Danish realm that doesn't fit standard sovereignty categories. Extending that ambiguity to include American partnership wouldn't create new precedent, just expand existing arrangements. International law accommodates creative solutions when all parties agree. The challenge is reaching agreement when public positions are entrenched and domestic politics in all three jurisdictions constrain flexibility. The next 18 months determine whether negotiation succeeds or confrontation escalates. Greenland's independence report arrives by end of 2026. That document will force concrete proposals. Once specific options are public, pressure increases on all governments to respond definitively. The current situation, where everyone states positions without consequence, cannot continue past that deadline. Either talks begin producing framework agreements, or positions harden into permanent opposition. Trump's second term ends January 2029. If acquisition hasn't advanced substantially by mid-2027, the political window closes. A different administration might not prioritize Greenland. The urgency is real, not manufactured. Military options remain on the table despite widespread opposition. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed that all options are always available for the president, though diplomacy remains the preferred approach. What does military intervention actually look like when the target is a NATO ally's territory populated by European Union citizens? The logistics alone make traditional invasion impractical. Greenland has no road network connecting settlements, no rail infrastructure. Transport depends entirely on aircraft and ships. An occupying force couldn't move overland. Every soldier, every vehicle, every supply crate would require air or sea transport in Arctic conditions, where temperatures drop to 40 degrees below zero. The United States military hasn't conducted cold weather operations at this scale since Korea. Current Arctic training focuses on small unit operations, not territorial occupation of 836,000 square miles. Patuxent Space Base provides existing foothold. 150 American personnel already stationed there could theoretically secure the immediate area. But expanding control beyond that single installation means establishing new bases across an island larger than Alaska and Texas combined. Denmark maintains minimal military presence in Greenland, a few patrol vessels, a handful of troops, surveillance equipment. They couldn't resist American forces militarily. Resistance would come from political and economic consequences, not battlefield opposition. NATO complicates everything. Denmark is a founding member. Article 5 commits all members to collective defense if one is attacked. Military action against Greenland triggers that obligation. Does the alliance defend Danish territory against American aggression? The scenario is unprecedented. NATO's entire 75-year history assumes external threats, primarily from the Soviet Union and later Russia. Internal conflict between members, especially involving the alliance's most powerful nation, has no playbook. European leaders have already issued joint statements defending Greenland's sovereignty. France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the United Kingdom declared that Greenland belongs to its people and decisions about its future rest solely with Denmark and Greenland. That's diplomatic language for warning America to back off. Economic retaliation would follow military action. European Union could impose sanctions. Trade agreements could be suspended. The transatlantic alliance that's anchored Western security since World War II would fracture, possibly permanently. Congressional opposition provides domestic constraint. House Speaker Mike Johnson, one of Trump's closest allies, publicly dismissed military intervention as something nobody is seriously considering. Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Roger Wicker stated clearly that Danish and Greenlandic officials have no willingness to negotiate transfer of their land. Senator Ruben Gallego introduced a resolution specifically to block invasion. These aren't fringe voices. These are senior Republicans who typically support presidential authority on national security matters. War powers debates intensified after recent Venezuela actions. The Senate advanced measures to restrict military operations without explicit congressional authorization. That precedent applies directly to Greenland. Any military deployment would require approval from a Congress that's already signaled opposition. The president could attempt a unilateral action, but funding would be cut off and legal challenges would follow immediately. Public opinion runs heavily against force. A YouGov poll showed only 8% of Americans support military action to acquire Greenland. 73% oppose it. Those numbers cross party lines. Even among Trump's base, enthusiasm for Arctic territorial expansion through invasion doesn't exist. The political cost would be enormous for minimal benefit, since military control without legitimacy creates permanent occupation burden. What about covert operations instead of overt invasion? Intelligence activities, cyber operations, influence campaigns designed to shift Greenlandic public opinion toward American alignment? That approach faces different obstacles, but similar fundamental problems. Greenlandic society is small and tightly connected. 56,000 people spread across isolated settlements where everyone knows everyone else. Covert influence operations require anonymity and scale. Neither exists in Greenland's social structure. The population has already turned sharply against American pressure. Protests in 2025 featured signs reading, "We are not for sale," and "Yankee go home." Those sentiments hardened through 2026 as Trump's rhetoric escalated. Additional pressure, whether overt or covert, pushes Greenlanders further toward independence from both Denmark and American influence. The strategy defeats itself. Russia and China watch these developments with intense interest. Moscow has invested heavily in Arctic military infrastructure since 2014. New bases, reconstructed airfields, expanded Northern Fleet capabilities. Russia considers itself the Arctic power and views American moves in Greenland as direct challenge to that status. Chinese officials have been quieter but no less attentive. Beijing declared itself a near-Arctic state in 2018 and launched the Polar Silk Road Initiative to expand presence in the region. American military action in Greenland would justify Russian and Chinese countermeasures. Moscow could accelerate Arctic militarization, establish new bases in disputed territories, increase submarine patrols through the GIUK gap. Beijing could offer Greenland massive development funding as alternative to American pressure, positioning China as protector of small nations against superpower aggression. The geopolitical consequences extend far beyond the immediate Arctic region. Denmark's threat assessment for 2025 marked the first time in history that their Defense Intelligence Service listed the United States as potential threat to national security, alongside Russia and China. That language shift reflects how seriously Copenhagen views current American posture. Academic analysts and security commentators describe ongoing American pressure as hybrid warfare, using economic and political coercion rather than military force, but pursuing the same objectives through different means. The $700 billion price tag estimated by scholars and former officials assumes negotiated purchase, not military seizure. That figure accounts for compensating Denmark for lost territory, funding Greenlandic development to replace Danish subsidies, and investing in infrastructure to make the acquisition economically viable. Military occupation would cost substantially more because it requires permanent force deployment, infrastructure development without local cooperation, and managing international sanctions that would follow intervention. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been tasked with developing a purchase proposal within coming weeks. That assignment signals the administration still prioritizes diplomatic approaches, despite military rhetoric. The proposal will likely involve some combination of direct payment to Denmark, long-term development funding for Greenland, expanded American investment in infrastructure and resource extraction, and security guarantees that formalize existing defense relationships. Whether such a proposal gains traction depends entirely on Greenlandic response. The Independence Report arriving by end of 2026 will outline specific options for separation from Denmark. That document determines what's negotiable. If the report proposes full independence with international recognition, American acquisition becomes harder because it requires convincing an independent nation to immediately surrender sovereignty. If the report suggests continued association with Denmark or ambiguous status, negotiation space expands. Timing pressures intensify throughout 2027. Trump's second term ends January 2029. A different administration might abandon Greenland acquisition entirely. The narrow window creates urgency that could facilitate agreement or trigger escalation, depending on how parties respond to deadline pressure. Greenlandic leaders know they're negotiating with a president who might not be there in 2 years. That knowledge affects their calculations about whether to engage seriously or wait out the current administration. The Democratic Party victory in March 2025 shifted Greenland's political landscape. This center-right party advocates gradual approach to independence rather than immediate separation. That position suggests openness to transitional arrangements, an agreement that provides substantial autonomy, significant development funding, and clear pathway to eventual independence while maintaining American security presence could appeal to Democratic's pragmatic wing. Prime Minister Mute Egede's statement that Greenlanders don't want to be Danish or American, but want to be Greenlandic, doesn't necessarily preclude association with America. It asserts identity and self-determination. An arrangement that respects Greenlandic identity while providing resources for genuine independence could satisfy that requirement. The question is whether American proposals can be structured to support Greenlandic self-determination, rather than replace Danish oversight with American control. Financial realities constrain Greenland's options regardless of political preferences. The island's economy generates roughly $3.5 billion annually. Denmark provides over $500 million in annual subsidies. That's $9,000 per resident. Independence requires replacing that funding. Rare earth mining offers potential revenue, but development requires decades and massive capital investment. Oil and gas reserves remain speculative until exploration resumes and production begins. American investment could bridge that gap, but only if structured as genuine partnership rather than colonial extraction. Greenlanders have watched resource companies promise development for 50 years, while delivering bankruptcies and environmental damage. Trust doesn't exist. Any American proposal must overcome that history with binding commitments, transparent governance structures, and mechanisms ensuring local control over development decisions. The international community watches how America structures these proposals because precedent matters. A deal that genuinely empowers Greenlandic self-determination while addressing security concerns could model partnership frameworks for other contested territories. A deal that resembles purchase of sovereignty with local population, treated as property transfers, reinforces colonial patterns that destabilize global order. European allies already warned that Greenland belongs to its people, not Denmark or America. That language frames sovereignty as residing in population, not governments. American proposals respecting that principle gain legitimacy. Proposals treating Greenland as transferable asset lose international support and face coordinated resistance. China and Russia benefit enormously from American heavy-handedness. Beijing positions itself as defender of small nations against Western imperialism while simultaneously bullying neighbors in South China Sea. Moscow claims NATO expansion justifies aggression while expanding Arctic militarization. American military threats against Greenland hand both adversaries propaganda victories worth billions in soft power. Every allied nation watching calculates whether American security guarantees remain credible or whether Washington prioritizes territorial acquisition over alliance integrity. That calculation determines force posture, defense spending, and willingness to support American initiatives globally. Denmark's threat assessment listing America alongside Russia and China as national security concern represents unprecedented shift. Danish intelligence services don't make such declarations lightly. The assessment reflects genuine concern that American actions threaten Danish territorial integrity and sovereignty. NATO's founding principle requires members defend each other against external threats. What happens when the threat comes from within the alliance? Article 5 doesn't address that scenario. The legal and political frameworks governing transatlantic security were not designed for member states threatening each other's territory. Denmark can't invoke Article 5 against America. But the precedent of intra-alliance territorial disputes fundamentally undermines collective defense credibility. Congressional opposition provides some constraint on executive action. Senator Wicker, stating that Greenlandic unwillingness to negotiate precludes purchase, acknowledges political reality. House Speaker Johnson, dismissing military action, signals that legislative branch won't fund or authorize intervention. These statements matter because American system requires congressional appropriations for military operations and territorial acquisitions. The president can't unilaterally purchase territory or deploy military force for acquisition without legislative support. War powers debates over Venezuela demonstrate Congress asserting constitutional authority over military deployments. That precedent applies equally to Greenland, but executive branch retains substantial unilateral capability. The president controls existing military assets, directs diplomatic initiatives, and sets foreign policy priorities. Trump can increase military presence at Patuxent Space Base, expand intelligence operations, pressure Denmark through trade policy, and support Greenlandic factions favoring American alignment. None of these actions require congressional approval. They create facts on ground that shape eventual outcomes regardless of legislative preferences. The question becomes whether Congress will actively block executive initiatives or merely voice disapproval while allowing actions to proceed. Public opinion in America shows limited support for Greenland acquisition, particularly through military means. YouGov polling found 73% oppose using force. That opposition constrains political viability of aggressive approaches. But public attention remains low. Most Americans couldn't locate Greenland on map or explain why acquisition matters. Low salience means presidential actions face minimal domestic political cost until crisis emerges. Vietnam and Iraq demonstrated that public opposition builds slowly as costs accumulate. Initial interventions often proceed with broad indifference that later transforms into active resistance. Greenlandic protests featuring signs reading "Yankee Go Home" and "We Are Not for Sale" demonstrate hardening attitudes. Each American threat strengthens anti-American sentiment and undermines constituencies that might otherwise consider partnership arrangements. The 6% of Greenlanders supporting American integration probably included individuals seeing economic opportunity. Military rhetoric converts potential supporters into opponents. You can't threaten populations into willing association. The psychology doesn't work. Coercion produces compliance when successful, never genuine partnership. Greenland under American control through pressure becomes permanent security liability, requiring constant occupation rather than willing ally providing strategic access. The Export-Import Bank's letter of interest to critical metals, Court for Tanbury's mine development represents alternative approach. $120 million in financing for rare earth extraction demonstrates American willingness to invest in Greenlandic development without demanding sovereignty transfer. That model could expand dramatically. Billion-dollar investments in multiple mining projects, infrastructure development, and renewable energy could transform Greenlandic economy while respecting sovereignty. American companies gain access to critical minerals. Greenlanders gain employment, revenue, and development. Denmark maintains formal sovereignty while reducing subsidy burden. Everyone benefits without territorial transfer. That cooperative framework requires patience. Mine development takes decades from initial investment to production. Infrastructure projects face Arctic climate challenges that multiply costs and timelines. Returns on investment occur over 20 to 30-year horizons, not quarterly earnings reports. American political system struggles with long-term strategic planning because electoral cycles reward short-term results. Presidents serve 4 or 8 years. Senators serve 6. Representatives serve 2. Nobody gets credit for projects that won't succeed until they've left office. But great power competition requires exactly that long-term thinking. China plans in decades and centuries. America must match that temporal perspective or lose strategic competition. In the coming months, determine whether American approach emphasizes partnership or coercion. Rubio's purchase proposal could structure genuine offer respecting Greenlandic self-determination, or it could demand sovereignty transfer in exchange for investment that should happen regardless. Greenland's independence report arriving late 2026 provides framework for negotiations. If that report outlines path requiring international support and investment, American response determines whether Washington becomes partner in Greenlandic independence or obstacle, attempting to replace Danish control with American dominance. Military posturing needs to stop immediately. Every threat strengthens opposition, damages alliances, and provides propaganda to adversaries. Diplomatic engagement requires credibility that threats undermine. You can't simultaneously threaten invasion and propose partnership. The contradiction destroys trust necessary for negotiation. American security interests in Arctic don't require Greenland becoming U.S. territory. They require access, cooperation, and assurance that hostile powers won't gain control. Expanded defense agreements, infrastructure investment, and resource development partnerships achieve those objectives without sovereignty transfer. The historical pattern shows territorial expansion through purchase succeeded when population supported transfer or remained indifferent. Louisiana Purchase involved minimal European settlement. Alaska Purchase included few Russian colonists and indigenous populations without voice and decision. Virgin Islands transfer involved a small population with limited autonomy. Greenland differs fundamentally. The population possesses clear political identity, institutional capacity for self-governance, and overwhelming opposition to American control. Those conditions make acquisition through purchase politically impossible without Greenlandic consent that currently does not exist, and won't emerge through pressure. What happens next depends on choices made in Washington, Copenhagen, and Nuuk. America can pursue partnership benefiting all parties. Denmark can facilitate Greenlandic independence while maintaining security cooperation. Greenland can leverage international interest to secure resources for genuine sovereignty. Or all parties can escalate toward confrontation nobody wants. The stakes extend beyond Greenland itself. Arctic governance, alliance credibility, great power competition, and precedents for territorial disputes in 21st century all hang on how this situation resolves. The outcome shapes whether rules-based international order survives or whether raw power determines territorial control. Greenland became test case for principles that structure global stability. How America proceeds determines what kind of power it wants to be. Climate change isn't slowing. The ice keeps melting at 30 million tons per hour. By 2030, vast sections of southern Greenland will be ice-free year-round. Those rare earth deposits everyone discusses become genuinely accessible. The Northwest Passage handles commercial shipping that currently uses Panama or Suez. Russian military presence in the Arctic continues expanding regardless of what happens in Ukraine. China's near-Arctic state declaration wasn't symbolic posturing. Beijing is positioning for long-term strategic competition in a region that becomes more valuable every year the temperature rises. America's window for establishing dominant Arctic presence is closing, not opening. Every year of delay allows competitors to build infrastructure, secure partnerships, and create dependencies that become harder to displace. The Trump administration understands this timeline even if execution remains chaotic. The urgency is real. Greenland's strategic value increases exponentially over the next 2 decades. Whoever controls access now shapes Arctic governance for the rest of the century. But control doesn't require ownership. That's the fundamental miscalculation driving current American approach. Patuxent Space Base already provides military positioning. Defense agreements can expand American presence without sovereignty transfer. Economic partnerships deliver resource access without political annexation. The $700 billion price tag buys nothing that couldn't be achieved through cooperation costing a fraction of that amount. Greenland's future likely involves independence from Denmark within 10 years. The March 2025 election brought pragmatic independence advocates to power. The late 2026 report will outline specific paths forward. Public support for separation from Denmark remains strong, even as opposition to American integration stays overwhelming. That independence creates opportunity for American partnership structured correctly. An independent Greenland needs security guarantees, development funding, and technical expertise for resource extraction. Washington can provide all three without demanding territorial control. The question is whether American political system can execute patient strategic engagement instead of transactional acquisition. Trump's real estate background views Greenland as property to own. But territory populated by European Union citizens with strong self-determination movements isn't real estate. It's sovereign people making choices about their political future. Respecting those choices, while offering genuine partnership, serves American interests better than coercion that guarantees permanent resistance. NATO survives this crisis only if military threats stop immediately. Denmark listing America as national security threat alongside Russia and China represents catastrophic alliance damage. European leaders defending Greenlandic sovereignty against American pressure signals, transatlantic relationships approaching breaking point. The strategic cost of fracturing NATO vastly exceeds any benefit from controlling Greenland. Arctic access means nothing if European allies no longer trust American security commitments and pursue independent defense arrangements, or worse, accommodation with Russia and China. Congressional opposition provides check on executive overreach if legislators choose to use available powers. War powers. Constraints, appropriations, control, and treaty ratification all require Senate involvement. The House controls funding. Neither chamber supports military action or unilateral territorial acquisition. Whether that opposition translates to binding restrictions depends on political will to confront executive branch directly. Venezuela precedent shows Congress reasserting constitutional authority over military deployments. Greenland tests whether that reassertion persists or collapses under presidential pressure. The Export-Import Bank, financing for Tanbreeze, rare earth mine demonstrates viable alternative path. American capital making Greenlandic development possible creates partnership serving mutual interests. Scale that model across multiple sectors. Finance port infrastructure in exchange for access agreements. Fund renewable energy projects, providing both local power and credentials for green technology leadership. Support fishing industry modernization. Build telecommunications networks. Every investment strengthens Greenlandic economy while creating American commercial presence that achieves strategic objectives without political domination. Chinese Belt and Road Initiative succeeded not through territorial acquisition, but through creating dependencies that constrain partner choices. America can deploy a similar strategy with crucial difference. Chinese partnerships often involve predatory lending and sovereignty erosion. American approach can offer transparent terms, local governance protection, and genuine development rather than extraction. That distinction matters enormously for Greenlandic decision-makers, choosing between potential partners. Beijing offers money with strings that strangle autonomy. Washington can offer resources that enable independence. Russia's Arctic military expansion continues regardless of American choices about Greenland. Moscow's strategic calculus focuses on controlling northern sea route and projecting power across Arctic Ocean. Greenland factors into Russian planning primarily as potential American asset to counter. If the United States pursues aggressive acquisition threatening NATO cohesion, Russia benefits from alliance fracture while maintaining Arctic advantages. If America instead strengthens NATO unity through respecting Allied sovereignty, Russia faces coordinated opposition to Arctic ambitions. The second scenario serves American interests far better than the first. What happens over the next 18 months determines Arctic governance for decades. Greenland's independence report arrives late 2026. American proposals responding to that report either facilitate Greenlandic self-determination through partnership or attempt to replace Danish oversight with American control. The difference between those approaches determines whether Greenland becomes willing American partner or hostile territory requiring permanent occupation. One path serves long-term strategic interests. The other satisfies short-term political ego while creating permanent security liability. Rare earth access doesn't require owning Greenland. Mining partnerships with independent Greenlandic government secure resource rights just as effectively as territorial control. Security positioning doesn't require annexation. Expanded defense agreements provide necessary military access without sovereignty transfer. Shipping route control doesn't need political dominion. Commercial partnerships and naval presence achieve the same objectives. Every stated American interest in Greenland can be satisfied through cooperation rather than acquisition. The $700 billion price tag reflects fundamentally wrong approach. That sum assumes buying territory like property transaction. But Greenland's value to America comes from partnership, not ownership. Invest that same $700 billion over 20 years in Greenlandic development through transparent agreements respecting sovereignty. Build infrastructure making rare earth extraction viable. Finance port facilities enabling Arctic shipping. Establish research stations advancing climate science. Create economic integration that serves both American strategic needs and Greenlandic development goals. That investment produces everything territorial acquisition promises without the catastrophic alliance damage and permanent occupation costs. Trump leaves office in January 2029. Whether Greenland policy survives, the transition depends on whether current approach achieves bipartisan support or remains partisan initiative. Congressional opposition from both parties suggests the latter. Future administrations might abandon acquisition efforts entirely if current strategy fails to show progress. The narrow window creates pressure for results that could drive escalation or force realistic reassessment. How administration responds to that pressure over the next 2 years determines whether this becomes historical footnote or genuine crisis. Greenlandic voices matter most in this equation. Prime Minister Egede stating, "We want to be Greenlandic," deserves respect, not dismissal. 85% opposition to American integration reflects genuine political sentiment that won't change through pressure. American policy must work with that reality, not against it. Support Greenlandic independence. Offer partnership without demanding subordination. Provide resources enabling genuine sovereignty rather than creating new dependency. That approach aligns American interests with Greenlandic self-determination instead of positioning them as opposing forces. The pattern is simple once you see it clearly. Greenland becomes more valuable every year as ice melts and geopolitical competition intensifies. America needs Arctic access, rare earth resources, and denial of those assets to competitors. Greenland needs development funding, security guarantees, and path to genuine independence. Those interests align perfectly if structured as partnership. They clash catastrophically if approached as property acquisition. The choice determines whether America shapes Arctic future as respected partner or declining power using coercion because cooperation failed. Russia and China watch American choices about Greenland as indicator of broader strategic competence. Successful partnership demonstrates sophisticated approach to great power competition. Failed acquisition attempt signals declining capability and alliance mismanagement. Both adversaries benefit from the second outcome. Neither wants America succeeding at Arctic integration through cooperation that could be replicated elsewhere. The stakes extend far beyond Greenland itself. How Washington handles this situation reveals whether American power rests on genuine leadership or just fading military dominance. Every territorial expansion in American history involved either willing populations, indigenous groups without political voice in decisions, or military conquest during different historical era with different international norms. Greenland fits none of those categories. The population possesses clear political identity, institutional capacity for self-governance, European Union citizenship, and overwhelming opposition to American control. International law and norms protect sovereignty in ways that didn't exist during Louisiana Purchase or Alaska acquisition. Military seizure would isolate America internationally and destroy alliance relationships essential to global position. The answer has been obvious from the beginning. Partner with Greenland, support independence, invest in development, secure resource access through commercial agreements, expand military cooperation through defense partnerships, achieve every strategic objective without demanding sovereignty transfer. That approach requires patience, respect, and long-term thinking. Whether American political system can deliver those qualities remains the only real question. The strategy is clear. The execution requires discipline. Current approach lacks entirely. Greenland doesn't need rescuing from Denmark. It needs resources for genuine independence. America can provide those resources in exchange for partnership serving mutual interests. That's the deal available if Washington stops treating sovereign people as property for sale and starts engaging as potential partners with legitimate interests deserving respect. The ice keeps melting, the strategic value keeps rising, the window for establishing productive relationship keeps narrowing. What happens next depends on choices made in the coming months by leaders who understand the stakes or fail to grasp them until opportunity passes completely.